Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shooting Podcast. My name is David Reedman. I'm the founder of the K-12 School Shooting Database. And this podcast is uncut conversations with experts across the school security industry. The guest today is really the original expert in school security. Dr. Ken Trump, no relation to the other Trump family, is the president of the National School Safety and Security Services Group. He has his ED in education. He's been working in this field for 4 decades. So, Dr. Ken Trump, welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you, David. I appreciate the opportunity, and we've had a number of conversations at various points in time. Follow your work, and it's good to have a conversation here, and thanks for the invitation.
So, the work that I've done researching school shootings looks at the problem a lot differently from some other projects because it takes it back in time. I'm interested in what happened in the 1960s and the 70s and the 80s. Is when you peel away the layers of, what's the impact of violent video games? What's the impact of social media? Well, you can find a time period when those things didn't even exist. Yet there were still a lot of the same issues that we're seeing today in schools were happening during that time period. So can you talk to me about where you started in school security, what you were doing then, and what the landscape was?
Yeah, it's fascinating to actually go back and take a look and pause to do that. I just started doing the math or redoing the math and realized that it's about more than 4 decades of being in pre-K through 12 school safety. Literally started in junior high class. I'm not counting it in 40 years, but it's an interesting story. I was in Cleveland City School District as a student, and in the late 1970s, the federal court, put the school district under a court-ordered crosstown busing federal desegregation order. And as part of that, due to racial inequities in academics and learning and education and the way the schools were structured, they created a federally ordered Division of Safety and Security. So I was a student in a typing class, for those of us who really go back and remember that one day, and a gentleman with a walkie-talkie walked in the room and talked to the teacher, and the teacher called me up, and I'm thinking, what did I do? And she said, Security Officer Connor here is looking for someone to type his report. She said, you're the fastest typer. Like, can you do his duty report? And the teacher asked, and I complied. And I started doing these duty reports, and I'm going, this looks really interesting. Well, I take them down to him, and he owned a pizza shop on the side, so I get a little free pizza as a bonus for doing that. And so this is kind of interesting, and got to talk with him and build a relationship. And when I moved up to high school, they had about a half a dozen or to a dozen safety and security personnel in the building. So instead of going to study hall, I was class valedictorian of high school, and I was caught up on my work, and I used to hang out in the office. I started typing their investigation reports, a little side money and a little more pizza, and really got interested in it. And the day after I graduated, I stayed on at the school working, volunteered a lot of extra time and part-time paid, and then was the first hire in the division. And I said, well, this is not a bad job while I work on my bachelor's, and at that time, social service, criminal justice concentration. Stayed there, developed a specialty in youth gangs, enjoyed working with the gang members. We had gang-related riots that would start at 7 o'clock in the morning when the kids were coming in school, 7:30. Really got to enjoy working with them. Also did a lot of reports that led to felonies and charges and criminal charges and expulsions, and kind of pulling together that end of it. We'd have weapons used and stuff. So that became a specialty, and I followed and tracked gangs in the school district and was the gang intelligence officer for the whole district, unofficially for 3 years, because the superintendent at the time said, we don't have gangs, we have organized youth student group misconduct. We can't use the G word. And then I wrote a grant with the grants writer, and they let us do that. I think they thought they were humoring me, but lo and behold, we actually won 2 grant awards and formed a 5-person team that dealt with all the gang-related issues citywide, investigations, enforcement on one end, and more importantly, de-escalation, intervention with kids, and prevention, talking with parents on that end. And that became a model. It was one of the first youth gang units, if not the first in a school district safety and security division. Reduced the gang-related incidents from where we started about 39% over the 3 years. Went out to suburban district as a security director and anti-gang project director on more grants, and then started doing consulting on a part-time basis. A professor friend of mine who's since passed, a dear friend, he was a criminologist at Ohio State University. I was his gang research coordinator on a project here. My now wife, who was a probation officer at the time, juvenile gang drug trafficking specialist, met and worked on that project. And he told me one time, he says, you go out and you're speaking to all these school districts. He says, I get paid to do that. You could probably have a little business doing this instead of doing it for free. And my lights came on, and it gave me an out where I got to deal with more districts, see what was going on, and eventually just built that into a full-time business that started while I got my bachelor's and master's, and 30 plus years later, actually closer to 40, just finished a doctoral degree in education at Johns Hopkins, looking at school administrators, strategic school safety leadership, and how that intersects with communicating about safety in highly and ambiguous and uncertain times. So we've had a chance to work. We're non-product affiliated, very strong on that, independence. We do independent security assessments, emergency planning, professional development, crisis intervention, post-crisis intervention, consulting with schools, and then in the past decade, a good deal of expert witness work, civil litigation expert witness work on everything from some of the highest profile mass school shootings to rape, other sexual assaults, child abduction, assaults, and different crimes of violence. So in that area has grown a lot as well. So long answer to a short question, David, is it's been an interesting ride. This has been I've been able to ride along through this journey in an area that really wasn't a professional field. It wasn't defined. It's still being defined. But it been there from the onset by accident, and then got in, and it's where I'm going to be, and take it all the way through. Still enjoy it, still excited about it, and oftentimes frustrated with things we see going on in the field as well.
So going back to the late 70s and 80s for a few moments, that was a period of time when there were deliberate school shootings. They were different from the ones today. It really wasn't an established identity. There wasn't all of the cultural lore around what it means to be a school shooter during that period. You mentioned gangs, and that period in criminal justice through the 70s into the 80s was the start of some pretty widespread tough on crime policies across the country. What were you seeing on the ground in schools each day during that time period around what were the threats people were worried about? What was the type of violence that was occurring? Kind of what actions were you taking?
Well, it's certainly different from where we are today, and we'll get to that point. But at that point, in the Cleveland City School District and in a lot of our large urban districts at the time, we did see rival neighborhood groups, rival gangs, gang-related conflicts. Most of the incidents of extreme violence, the shootings, occurred outside of the school in the neighborhoods, but would spill back into the schools in terms of fighting, large-scale riots, disruptive behavior. We did confiscate weapons, certainly at that point in time, but fewer school shootings in school and even outside of school, as you talk about a lot appropriately. So higher attention for riots and fights at dismissal, concerns about outsiders being around in the gangs, but certainly not the level of anxiety, ambiguity, and uncertainty we see today about shootings in school and shootings around school. But I was also around that period in the where we started seeing into the 90s. As we segued into the 90s, you started seeing the early larger scale school shootings. Pearl, Mississippi, Paducah, Kentucky, Jonesboro, Arkansas, places that few of us actually remember by name.
Yeah.
Now, you don't hear those that often.
Yeah, really the starting point for a school shooting driving national legislation and policy was in 1989 in Stockton at Cleveland Elementary. And that was a man who was homeless, lived near the school, had severe mental illness, untreated mental illness. And he set a vehicle on fire next to the school. When the students started evacuating, he shot 30 kids there at the elementary school. And that led to the immediate passage of California's assault weapons ban because he used a military-style rifle. That led to, in 1990, the Gun-Free School Zones Act signed by President Bush. In 1993, when President Clinton signed the federal assault weapons ban, the surviving sister of one of the kids killed there in Stockton is standing next to him at the table. And then in 1994, the Safe Schools Act that opened up for the first time Department of Justice funding being available for school policing and school security. How did you see that transition moving from that kind of gang level, individual issue focus to all of a sudden school safety being a national level topic in the 90s?
Well, it's certainly a whole different world, right? When we started seeing it happen in suburban, rural, and other communities. And it got to point out that this is not just an inner city issue. It's not just an issue for children with minority backgrounds and urban school communities. This is a problem that extends out to suburban to rural areas and elsewhere. And that certainly shifted the focus of people because they realized, or at least some people realized, the mindset of it can't happen here was really you operating with blinders and ostrich syndrome. And then there's still a lot of denial of that, right? We still hear people today think it can't happen here. It has happened everywhere, but it's not happening here.
Yeah, well, it's actually a uniquely small and rural community problem for the highest casualty incidents. Over the last 60 years, the 18 of the 25 shootings that had the highest total number of victims injured or wounded were all in communities of under 50,000 people. The two planned attacks that happened so far in 2024 were 40 miles outside of Des Moines in Perry, Iowa, and that's a tiny community of a couple thousand, and in rural Wisconsin, which fits the profile of these incidents across this whole 60-year period.
Well, and you go back to the Clinton era for a moment, if you can. You hit on something there with the funding of school resource officers, the COPS program, community-oriented policing, Cops in Schools program, really unlocked, millions of dollars to put police officers in school after Columbine. And we started to see the presence of the officers. And quite frankly, I think that the model that they set up at that time, I still recall that to get that funding, which is a step down funding model, you get 100% and 75-50 down or something similar to that. And then you have to eventually pick up the cost 100%. Was interesting in that it put not only officers in schools, but to get those grants, it required that the administrators and the SROs be trained on best practices, the triad model, those things that NASRO created, the National Association of School Resource Officers type model on what is a school resource officer and getting administrators on the same page. And then what we saw is that money was flowing. There was also something called the REMS grant, Readiness and Emergency Management for Schools. And that put out grants directly to school districts without pass through to the states for applicant school districts to kind of see where they were on prevention and intervention, mitigation, preparedness and response, tailor individual grants to shore up the things where they had gaps. And it really let school districts do good things. So you had the REMS grants going, you had the COP schools grants going. Well, as time moved on through the 90s, that money dried up. When the SRO programs, it was always interesting to watch and some very frustrating when it got down to that point. Everything was great when it was 100% paid for by the federal government. Then the local schools started pointing fingers to the police, and the police started pointing back saying, I thought you were going to pick up these costs when the money was gone. I thought you were going to do it. So we got into those dynamics in the mid to the late 20s. The REMS grants were chopped away, and I think it was one of the best programs that they ever had in the federal government. But it got caught up in federal budget negotiations. It was something they could slice off when they were cutting deals on extending the federal budget for 3 months. And it went to the wayside. So by the time we hit Sandy Hook, you saw that REMS grants were gone. The Office of Safe and Drug-Free Schools was gone. The Cops in Schools program was pretty much decimated over a period of time, and local schools picked up. Many cut back or even eliminated those programs. And those were never really shored back up. And schools can't be run school safety on a grant funded luxury, as I used to call it, and still do even today. If you're running your school safety program on hopes of running from one grant to the next, you're really not buying in, literally and figuratively. You don't have sustainability. Your programs are at risk. And then the other piece is, I think now when we look at school resource officer programs, I support properly designed, implemented, evaluated, researched, and funded school resource officer programs. It's hard to quantify prevention, as you well know as a researcher, but a lot of things are prevented that we can't quantify. Where we see problems with those programs, I still believe, is when we're not following the best practices. And I've had some conversations with the leadership in those districts that removed, at the murder of George Floyd around that time, removed officers from schools, David. And I always tell them, if you're going to throw out the police officers, you should throw out your administrators with them, because it's supposed to be a partnership. And if you're saying your police screwed up, well, shame on your administrators for allowing it to get that way, because they're a 50-50 partner in this thing. So I think that we lost from those Clinton era days with the SRO programs. Number one, requiring the training of the officers and the administrators together to get that advanced SRO training and basic training, so that they know what the program's about and they're on the same page. We've lost the continuity on the funding. Are we getting the right officers? All these things come under the best practices. So as we moved into the Sandy Hook era and beyond, the threats have also changed. And as in the last 3 to 5 years, I think we're getting more and more into the unknown unknowns. A man follows two girls into a high school, and the administrator and SRO stops the person and says, "Why are you here?" And he says, "I'm here to hurt children." A person found in a restroom in a middle school offering kids needles. How do we get to this? A stranger goes into a building and stabs a kid. These are things that don't fall into what we're seeing being the 85 to 125 page average emergency plan today, that nobody from the superintendent to the custodian knows what the hell's in there. So it's a whole different world from back in those days in the early 70s and 90s. The threats have changed. The policy and the politics is more competitive. And now we're adding in the vendors, the lobbying, the private equity money. And as I said, 5 years in a doctoral program, and you come out, of course, with answers to the narrow question that you looked at, or at least the direction, and a hell of a lot more questions to go with it. And it's really a mess. Somebody asked me, I was talking to a reporter, says, "Well, how would you sum up the field today?" And I said, it's a S blank show.
Well, I mean,
I don't want to bleep your program here. I don't want to bleep your program, but it really is a mess.
Yeah, well, you trace the reasons for that mess, and that is a lot of disparate legislation in the 90s, things that were built to be capacity building. This is exactly the same thing that happened across the country with Department of Homeland Security funding after 9/11. Initially, there was a flood of increasing local capabilities, but as soon as the federal money for that dries up, stuff just gets put in the closet. Teams that were created get just disassembled because there's no money there. And that's what happened in schools. But what's interesting is, so you have this run up on funding and capacity in the 90s, but you get to incidents like Jonesboro, Arkansas, where it's a planned attack by an 11 and a 13-year-old shooting 20 kids at the school. The next year you have Columbine. Columbine leads to all of this legislative energy around taking action. It doesn't really change anything physically at the school. It changes police response procedures, and it starts to create this idea of maybe we need to lock down, maybe there needs to be some sort of school planning, but that doesn't really take effect in a widespread way until you get to the 2010s. And then Parkland happens, and it occurs in this moment where suddenly it spurs massive legislative mandates. Florida, within 4 weeks of that shooting, pass legislation that changed the entire way that school discipline and school security programs are laid out. Where are we now compared to where we were right after Parkland when everything started to get formalized?
Well, if you step back for one moment, my observation on Columbine was it was probably the most bipartisan response I've seen, period. And I guess you can't do period and an and, but period, comma, and also uh, since that time, because it was really pretty bipartisan. You had Clinton and you had a Republican Congress at that time, as I recall, and they came out at least with some meaningful programs. They were trying. They weren't perfect. I was critical of a lot of things out of the Department of Education that they could have done differently. Could have been more transparent on the extent of school crime. Could have got some tracking, which you still do better than anybody, and the government can get close to. Uh, but it was at least we're talking what works, what doesn't work. Let's test it. Let's evaluate it. Let's have a balanced, comprehensive approach. And then as you got into the Sandy Hook time period, so all of that money's gone. I think we did raise awareness after Columbine. I think it did bump things up to a different standard in terms of training awareness, some drills and things. So I think there were some things that were kind of sort of became institutionalized within education to some extent. But then you got around the Sandy Hook era, and the federal response was different. It's much more polarized, much more political. The response after Sandy Hook very much went into gun control and gun rights. It became extremely polarized. And I think we shut down when we become very polarized. And what I was surprised at Sandy Hook is nobody really went back and said, okay, what did we do well after Columbine in terms of policy? The bipartisan effort, did REMS work? Could we tweak that? Could we bring it back? Could we improve that to meet the current times? What do we do right? What do we do wrong with SROs? What are the things are missing? How do we pull comprehensive together, which is the key word in research? It seems that everybody's forgotten. And some are now coming back out with like it's brand new. They reinvented the wheel. You go to the research, and research shows that comprehensive is the right approach, is the best practice. It's also the hardest to implement, right? But it became very political. And in Parkland, I think we had, to your point, we have to also look at where these things happen, who the players are, who the actors are, who are the protagonists, what's the politics, what's the activism, and at the Parkland time, what we didn't have as much of at Sandy Hook and at Columbine was the vendor, the lobbying, and the private equity influence from Parkland up to the present time. Obviously, Uvalde, many other incidents in between there. So if you look at it in cycles and waves, it was always you had a high-profile shooting like a Columbine or a Sandy Hook. You had the overnight experts, charlatans, gadgets, and gurus, as I once wrote. Everything pops up, and then a couple of years later, when the money dries up, so do they, and they fade away, and we sort of things level off, and the conversation levels off a little bit when the money's gone. The hysteria levels off. And then you go into the next one, right? Then you go into the next one. And what's happened in the last few years is the hysteria has just gotten more hysterical because you've got more money, more politics, more activists and advocates. And, I've written about this. I kind of create four broad groups, right? Very broadly speaking. You have activists who may be active with a social or political issue, gun control, gun rights, as an example. You have advocates, a lot of parents, whose families have been victimized with the loss of kids, or former administrators, educators, who are advocating for certain things. Some of them very skewed. Some of them are going off in 60 million directions, and some of them with vendors crawling behind them and funding and supporting their advocacy. Then you have experts, which if you get into the field, at least doing the litigation to be qualified as an expert is based on education, training, and experience. Those are the criteria. And then you have the fourth category of opportunists. Everybody that's jumping on the bandwagon. So we tell school administrators, everybody has a voice, right? Everybody should have a voice and be heard, and we respect that. But you kind of have to filter, where are you getting the information from here? Is it advocate, activist, expert, opportunist? And that area has become more and more murky, more and more harder and harder to define, and it's exceeded, as we've talked about on the social media platforms, to the point now where it's gone to extremes of where you have private equity firms, you have states being lobbied for legislation for school safety money that's not based on things like the REMS grants or the COPS grants of the Columbine era, post Columbine era, in the Clinton era. It's based on what's going to benefit a particular vendor who pays the most as the best lobbyist, who gets the legislation written very narrowly, where the money that's put loose for schools can be used almost only exclusively for what they're selling. And that's a whole different world from where we were in the Clinton era with those programs.
Yeah, it is a different world there. And it brings me kind of full circle to where the K through 12 school shooting database started. Right after Parkland, I wanted to know why school shootings are occurring. What are the characteristics? What's the frequency? What are the common threads so you can figure out how to prevent them? And there wasn't any good data available. Like, you couldn't say definitively in the day after Parkland, was this year worse than last year or the year before? Was this shooting different from other shootings? There wasn't any of this benchmarking. So if you don't have data and you don't have empirical evidence, you can't do program evaluation because you don't have any information to evaluate your program against. And what I think about over these last 25 years is Columbine happened, the Secret Service became formally involved in school safety, and there was a change in the way that police respond to incidents. That didn't stop Sandy Hook from happening a decade later. And many of the same things that went wrong there at Columbine kind of repeated themselves again. There wasn't a new level of prevention to stop one of the worst school shootings in history. But the outcome of Sandy Hook was really institutionalizing this idea of lockdowns and lockdown drills and student-involved security efforts inside every school. That was a change, and probably not a change that if any of the kids at Sandy Hook had done lockdown drills, it wouldn't have saved any other lives there. And then from there, we move a half decade later to Parkland in 2018. And I don't want to forget about Marshall County, Kentucky, where 20 students were shot 3 weeks before Parkland, or Santa Fe, Texas, where 27 people were shot at the school 2 months later. But Parkland changed something where all of a sudden there was federal and state money, and then there was this state legislation mandating how you're going to do school safety. But even with that change and that investment, 5 years later, we have the worst school shooting in U.S. history in Uvalde. Something that it's unbelievable that 25 years after Columbine, something like that could happen in a school. And the response to it was even more money and even more state legislation.
We legislate by anecdote. I just published a piece in the blog on legislating by anecdote. And that's a problem, and something I learned from my criminologist friend, dear friend, who's no longer with us, sadly. But taught me early on, we legislate by anecdote. You have an incident, you throw money at it, you throw policy at it, you throw the legislators get a soundbite, right? And we can say that we did something. And we have, after each of these incidents, what I call a do something, do anything, do it now, and do it fast type of public policy, which isn't good public policy. The worst time to make changes, even in a school district, is immediately after an incident, because it typically becomes that security theater that we so often talk about, the shiny objects, the visible, tangible. I mean, this is my dissertation, focus of research of how do you lead as a leader, be transparent, authentic with your school community, and then how do you avoid and communicate, and how do you bring in the communication with that before an incident ever happens, and then during and after an incident, without throwing up shiny objects and trying to get the physical, tangible things to appease people. And that's the answer. I mean, I've talked with school superintendents. I know people who've talked with legislators. I've talked with legislators who said, yeah, I agree with everything that you say, but we're still going to do this. And we're doing this because it serves a political or school community relations goal that they have, not necessarily a school safety, a meaningful research, evidence-based best practice school safety goal. Interestingly enough, I testified to Congress over the years 4 times. 99 at first, 2007, 2009 era after that. And in all of those, I talk about the lack of federal mandatory school crime reporting and data. I actually started trying to do what you did, try to just throw up something in a much less sophisticated way years ago, and kind of said it's a full-time job. Is I'm telling you something you really know, right? And we need to fund that, which wasn't funded. So it's like, okay, I have to pay the bills here. I can't do that. But so I applaud you for that, because your data is better than what we'll ever get from the federal government. We can debate definitions. They're still debating definitions, but at least we can say, all right, here's how I define it. Here's what we're doing. I'm sure from an academic end, we know there's a lot of debate and discussion, right? But it's something that you can point to, not something that comes out of the federal government 3 years after the fact. It's a hodgepodge collection of a half a dozen uh, mixed
Yeah.
very limited surveys. So, and then I think the Parkland again is, where do you have the loudest voices? What are the political dynamics? What's the unique context of each of those? What's the context of Uvalde, the community, the politics, the dynamics? What's the context of Parkland? And the interesting thing is, if you look at Parkland, you can take 3 or 4 parent advocates from there, several who are very vocal in the national scene, and everybody has a different answer, right? One thinks panic buttons are the answer to everything. If we only had a panic button, this would prevent a school shooting. If we only had armed teachers, this would be a shooting. If we only had bullet-resistant glass, this wouldn't have happened. Well, number one, what's the evidence for any of that aside from single incident advocacy and opinions? And I respect those, but where does grieving and where does advocacy stop and public policy and funding begin? And where does evidence-based and data-based stuff come in? And that's a murky line now. That's a very,
Yeah.
very murky line.
Well, I've used the analogy before that there are horrible car crashes that happen, and somebody that loses their teenage kids and their friends in a horrible car crash can be an advocate for motor safety, but that person isn't the best person to design the next highway. You need transportation data and engineers to design the safer highway. And that's what we haven't done in school safety. There are a lot of people at the center of very personal experiences with a single incident or a single subset of that incident, the way that it's personal to them. And then that shapes the outlook on every future incident, even though they're completely different. And I think something that you brought up a number of times in these last 2 years that is so different from any other period in this school safety industry is COVID funding. And I mean, I'm shocked. You hear COVID funding, school security, it doesn't make any sense. What's the connection? Can you just kind of explain what happened with COVID funding in the last 2 years?
And I think that ties into those high-profile voices that you hear on the advocacy end, is because there are also vendors behind them, either directly or indirectly, who are profiting or can't stand to profit from the advocacy that's going on, because they happen to sell items that fit the same narrative. How close those ties are remain to be seen. But that goes to the availability of the funding, and the ESSER funds, the COVID pandemic funds in particular, have created a pot of gold outside of the local school budget, where school administrators have turned to after a high-profile incident to solve political and school community relations problems. We have a gun incident or multiple gun incidents. The parents are upset. The media is paying attention. I have a pot of gold here and so, okay, $3 million, $5 million, $7 million, whatever the pot is, I can dip into that, put up some shiny objects, weapons detection systems, AI weapons detection systems and software, bells and whistles, more hardware, target hardening, and I can point to the parents and to the media and say, see, I've done something. Would they have done the same thing if it came out of their school budgets versus outside grants, either state grants or the COVID money? My 40 years of experience has said they wouldn't have, or if they did, it wouldn't be that quickly. So it's a quick fix to a problem. It's a perfect storm, right? I have a problem. I have the political pressure. I have the media attention. I have a pot of money. Problem solved. And what they're doing is it's solving their political problem. It's kicking problem down the can down the road, the problem down the road, because now that money's dried up, you have to pay for the continued software that's underlying these AI systems, the hardware that you're leasing, and if you don't, it's done. And then how do you
Right. So
explain that
looking
to the
into
community? So
your
where are we going to pay for this? Where are we going to pay for this in the next couple of years? And what we're seeing, just to button that up, is now I'm already seeing the vendors coming out. They know that well's run dry or running dry. So now they're already putting together a list. Well, here's state grants that you can get. And it leaves educators running grant to grant to grant, and in a panic. And how you have no sustainability. You're just covering your political behind, and you're saving face because you don't want to, or you can't stop doing what you did that maybe you shouldn't have done in the first place.
and that's where we are right now. For anybody listening who's not familiar with what happened, there was a huge amount of federal COVID funding that went down to states. States were supposed to use it for different COVID recovery and capacity building and other emergency management programs. But when that funding was never well defined, it was really easy to shift it to school safety. And that's what has happened in states across the country. So we are not going to be able to spend all this COVID money. Rather than it just going back to the federal government, going back to taxpayers, it becomes freebie money to just spend on anything with very little accountability. But that money, if it's not spent by the fall of this year, I think by September of this year when the federal fiscal year ends, that money disappears. So there is not going to be a random, as Ken said, $3 or $5 or $10 or $15 million to tap into for a county. So what happens at schools in terms of security over the next 5 years? What's your prediction there?
Yeah, the real painful part of that is a lot of that the ESSER funds, the pandemic funds, it was also used not just for the security, but also for the counselors, the social, emotional, mental health, the intervention specialists. And that is where I'm seeing the immediate losses. We've already worked in districts that have been cutting millions of dollars for the next school year, eliminating positions. And, we recently worked in a district where we were there for a good period of time and finished up the report and did our debrief. And people said, "What's your number one thing?" I said, and they're looking to think I'm going to make a physical security, a hardware technology. I said, do everything you can to sustain those social workers. The schools need more, not less. That's my top school safety recommendation. And people paused and said that wasn't what we were expecting, because school safety is about people. The first and best line of defense is a well-trained, highly alert staff and student body. Number one way we find out about weapons plots and kids who are going to cause harm is when they come forward and talk to an adult that they trust. It is about situational awareness, pattern recognition, training staff on cognitive decision making. We're not going to be able to solve or make a dent in a people-related problem with a hardware technology solution. At best, it's only a tool. It's come up with a ton of fidelity of implementation, and I can tell you issues, and I can tell you that what I'm seeing is we see more cases going from the schoolhouse to the courthouse. The expert witness litigation work that I do, civil litigation work, continues to grow because parents are frustrated, problems aren't being solved. People are not implementing programs with fidelity of implementation, or the challenges are there. The facts and merits of every case vary, but the common thread of these cases is they involve allegations of failures of human factors: people, policies, procedures, training, communications. Some cases are not credible, in my opinion. Some of them have credibility. I do plaintiff, expert, wit, and defense work, so I look at cases in a balanced way. And I think that what we're going to see is the bottom falls out right of the COVID funds. Some people are going to jump to the next grant if they're lucky, but in the long haul, it's going to become a question of sustainability. I don't see where school districts are going to be able to sustain the things that they paid for with COVID funds out of their operating budgets. There's going to be some really ugly and tough decisions. The problems aren't going away. The anxiety is the number one thing I hear from principals when I ask, what is your top school safety concern? Anxiety, one word. Increased anxiety with kids. And we're seeing that bleed over into anxiety with staff as well, trying to manage that. And I think that what's going to happen is eventually, the curtain's going to be pulled on the wizard behind a lot of these lobbying and private equity and legislative sweetheart deals that are being made. And people are going to stop and go, wow, how did this happen? And I'd like to think that that'll self-correct. I think that what happens is the system somewhat self-corrects in the litigation world. But if you get the litigation, that usually means that a kid or a staff member have been hurt or killed. And that's not where we want to get. We want to stay to that, as the saying goes, left to bang to the prevention end of things. So I'm hoping and trying to continue to advocate, as you and others do, to get the point out to school people is we have to focus on our people. I'm hoping that light bulb comes on and people saying, okay, maybe we need to reset the course here. And unfortunately, there's some people who are experiential learners, right? Just like the kids that we deal with. The only way they learn is through experiencing it, and unfortunately, that can be a hard hit for people.
And if people want to hear more about kind of a wellness-based, student-centric approach, a prior episode is called "Can School Nurses Prevent School Shootings?" And that's with Robin Kogan, who's on the National Association of School Nurses, talks about the need for a student wellness team that's nurse-led with social workers, with mental health professionals, because it's not just about preventing shootings, which that can do. School shootings are purposeful, deliberate attacks they're warning signs for weeks, months, or years in advance, but also dealing with student mental health, depression, substance abuse, abuse at home, depression. Student wellness centered pieces are some of the cheapest solutions. When you look at the prices of different staff members, a school nurse, a social worker are among the lowest compensated people in a school district. It's a sad state of affairs because they do so much. But Ken, as we're running out of time here, my final question for you is: next presidential administration, whoever it is, decides to appoint you to be the director of the Federal Department of Education. And there in the Department of Education, you can put forth one blanket policy for school security across the country. What would you do?
It has to be a comprehensive approach. It goes back to what the research shows, what experience shows. It goes back to the post-Columbine era. Even with the REMS grants that were in place there, was all about taking, from prevention all the way through to recovery, and taking a comprehensive approach. So, try to calm the politics, the political agendas, the money side of this, the lobbying. Do I think that somebody, Ken Trump or anybody else, could accomplish that? No, I don't. But I think that we need a reset here, and we need to at least raise the voices of those who know what the research says, who knows what the evidence-based data says, and get them on level footing and at least have a voice. So when the special interests come knocking at the door of the legislators or the school administrators, there's also a voice on the other side saying, time out, take a look at this too.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything that's put in place without evidence is somebody's assumption. And assumptions are not the way to develop strong public policy and strong school security practices. So I want to thank you so much. The guest today was Dr. Ken Trump. He's the president of the National School Safety and Security Services Group. He's the original expert in school safety. And this is a man that knows more about this, has thought more about this over a longer period of time than just about anybody in the country. So thank you so much, Ken.
Yeah, thanks for all the work that you do, David, and thanks for the conversation. Look forward to continuing it.
Okay, take care.